Good day and welcome, everyone. Anywhere in the world that you are, we bid you a warm welcome. My name is Henrietta Bankole-Olishino, and I serve as Vice President and Practice Lead of Economic Inclusion at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, and I am based in Lagos, Nigeria. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our panelists, all participants and audience from all over the world, and my colleagues at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. And I welcome you to this webinar, our innovative approaches to accelerate your philanthropy webinar. This webinar is the second in our Reimagining Philanthropy webinar series that will take place in the coming months, highlighting and illustrating themes from our upcoming 2-volume RPA book, Reimagined Philanthropy, A Roadmap to a More Just World. The goal is to bring together and refresh the guides, the tools, and trends we've talked about over the past 20 years. The book will reflect the direction the philanthropy sector is moving in, the urgency of this moment, and how this is all aligned to RPA's new mission. As some of you may be aware, RPA's new mission, which we crafted just last year, is to accelerate philanthropy in pursuit of a just world. Interestingly, our webinar today is aptly titled Innovative Approaches to Accelerate Your Philanthropy. At RPA, we do believe that philanthropy has a responsibility to pursue equity, and the decisions that we take are centered on people and communities. This book draws on our practice-based insights over the years, thoughtful interrogation of philanthropy's legitimacy, first-hand experiences and approaches for centering equity, which we have garnered for more than 20 years. It explores how funders and our assets and thought leadership can accelerate philanthropy through flexible approaches, irrespective of geography or focus areas. This webinar today is featuring panelists from the United States, the Netherlands, and Turkey. And we have panelists who work globally, highlighting to us intersectional approaches and tactics for increasing inclusion and diversity. We expect to have an interesting and insight-stimulating conversation today as we discuss innovative approaches for working effectively on challenging issues while addressing the real root causes and providing real cross-cutting solutions that are effective at the communities and for the people that need them. People and communities are at the heart of the work we do in philanthropy, you will agree with me. So we hope to talk about inclusive practices that center people and communities, as well as the intersectionality that can also help us to drive greater impact. We'll showcase today the transformative power of strategies such as Lever for Change's open call challenge model, and Lourdes Foundation's multifaceted approach for acceleration, as well as Esas Social's approach to providing equal opportunity in employment for young people in Turkey. I am really looking forward to our conversation today that we will be having with our very esteemed panelists. Our panel today is truly diverse with varied approaches, different geographies, and distinct focus areas that make the panel even stronger, because despite these differences, each of these individuals and their organizations are accelerating their philanthropy towards a more just world, with the key being flexible approaches that are adaptable and responsive to the people and communities that they serve. So I start with Amol Mehra. He's the Director of Industry Programs at Lourdes Foundation, where he oversees programs that address the dual crisis of inequality and climate change through industry action in fashion, the built environment, finance, and labor rights. Welcome, Amol. We have Phyllis Bickman. She's the founding director and social investment advisor at Esas Social, where she has worked on developing the structure and strategy for the firm, which was established in 2015 to manage social investments for the Esas Group. I should also mention that Phyllis is a fellow Anderson Consulting Accenture alum. Welcome, Phyllis. We have Christine Molyneux, who is the Vice President of Program Strategy and Learning at Lever for Change, which is MacArthur Foundation's affiliate. Her work is amplifying social impact by reinventing big philanthropy for donors, extraordinary causes, and creative thinkers looking to solve the world's biggest problems. Welcome to our panelists today. We'll start with a few questions, and there will be also an opportunity for Q&A at the end. And also to mention that everyone who has signed up for this webinar will receive both a recording of the webinar and an email with a digital copy of the book once it is launched. In the meantime, please feel free to send your questions using the Q&A or the chat box. And so I go on to our questions, and I start with you, Amor. Converging and intersectional challenges of the world today can often feel overwhelming. How has the Lourdes Foundation positioned its philanthropy to rethink and address interconnected problems differently through a systems lens to lead towards industry transformation? If you could just talk about, specific examples that showcase that intersectionality of issues that you work on and how transparency has played a role in your work. Amor.
Fantastic. And thanks so much, Henrietta, for this invitation, and to RPA for putting together this panel discussion. I'm certainly planning to learn a lot from my fellow panelists and from those folks in the chat room. So as Henrietta said, do encourage the dialogue to spread into the chat as well, and we can pull out some of those threads. As Henrietta mentioned, I'm with the Lourdes Foundation, and we started a couple years ago with this sort of challenge to address the dual crises of climate change and inequality. And interestingly, as we've learned from our partners and from colleagues in broader philanthropy, the sort of idea that these challenges are unlinked is a fallacy. The reality is that climate change impacts people, and that people are the key to solving climate change. So increasingly our work at Lourdes Foundation looks at that nexus, that space between climate and inequality, and where we can drive real wins and protections for people, mostly for us. The focus is on workers, communities, and producers in certain supply chains that we work in, and how we can center their lived experience and their agency and collectivizing their agency as critical drivers of addressing the climate crisis. Our focus at Lourdes is to work through sectors of the economy that have a high footprint on either climate and inequality. So that's why we focus on fashion, about, depending on the studies, but around 10% of emissions, built environment up to 40% of emissions. And then, of course, our work in finance, which is the cross-cutting, it's the lever of change, and then on labor rights as well. We're exploring other sectors that have significant impacts. And what we do there is we grant make in those sectors to partners, frontline communities, advocacy organizations, think tanks, who are driving change and transformation of those sectors. Our theory is that if we can motivate these sectors to change, we can see a change in the global economy that values people and nature and addresses the climate crisis that we're in. So the questions of intersectionality are core to our work. Again, we don't really consider ourselves just a climate foundation or an equity foundation. We consider ourselves a nexus foundation. And increasingly, we're calling on other donors and philanthropies to look at these issues as linked. I'll give some examples of how we carry out our work. Increasingly, we're funding on the areas of just transitions. So we've set up a number of partnerships where we're going to be accelerating both industry pathways, government pathways around how to engage in just transitions, moving their economic systems and sectors off of extractive bases of energy towards regenerative, while at the same time promoting labor rights and community inclusion in those processes. So it's more than just agency, it's really ownership. And our work on labor rights over the years has really solidified a model of working where we build and support the capacity of workers to organize themselves, to claim their rights, and then to scale those rights in towards national and other policy advancements in their jurisdictions. The tricky part here, of course, is that we're looking at these systems that are deeply entrenched. We're challenging a dominant economic model that is based on value equals money. And so what we are trying to do is articulate a new pathway that can be inclusive and that respects people's dignity rights while addressing the climate impacts there. Outside of our core grant work, I'd love to also share an innovation approach that we adopt at Loudest Foundation, perhaps more relevant to this conversation here, which is what we call our lighthouses. Now, these are specific large investments that we make to accelerate a particular challenge in a sector. So for instance, in the fashion sector, what we realized when we were looking at the climate crisis was that there wasn't enough innovation in the materials that are used for fashion. So we supported an organization called Fashion for Good and helped start that up. The idea there is they're scaling innovators by connecting them with brands so that we start seeing a different supply chain in fashion that moves off of polyester and oil-based materials and into alternatives to those. In the built environment space, we've also created a lighthouse initiative called Built by Nature. Here, the idea is to promote regenerative basis of materials, including the use of sustainable timber in the built environment. Again, this is trying to unlock the power of buildings to be carbon sinks. So you see here, our application is both to leverage industry gaps that we see can be tweaked and pivoted to drive that sectoral transformation, but all the while addressing that cross-cutting equity as core to solving the climate crisis. I'll stop there, Henrietta.
Great, thank you, Amol. I love it. Moving from agency to ownership, looking at all of the issues and addressing those issues because they are interconnected. I love it. The innovation approach, the lighthouses, and ensuring that you are, accelerating specific challenges within these sectors. I really, really, appreciate that, Amol. I'll move on to Phyllis now. Phyllis, you were founding director of Essa Social and worked on developing the structure and the strategy. From when you started in 2015 and where you are now with a lot of geopolitical and economic changes in the world, what has changed in how you approach your work and how you have adapted your strategy to respond to the changing landscape?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I did unmute myself. Everybody can hear me. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you, RPA, especially Olga, for the invitation, and congratulations to the RPA team, which I have worked on on assignment. Congratulations on the new mission. I find it to be very meaningful and purposeful. I like this framework of thoughtful, equitable, and effective. Essas Holding was founded by Şevket Sabancı and his two children, Ali Sabancı and Emine Sabancı Kamışlı. And it was this family team and their extended family that actually wanted to transition their influence and their thinking for greater equality in youth employment into this space. And so since 2014, actually, we started working on the strategy and structure. And since 2015, we've been, using Amal's expression, trying to challenge the dominant assumption that young people who graduate from good schools are valuable employees. And this is where in emerging markets, especially when you have a lot of young people, a lot of educated young people, you start to see a significant decrease in diversity and equity in the types of young people that are actually offered jobs, even though they all have similar degrees. So that's what we've been tackling. And we see a couple of things happening here. So about 10 or 15 years ago, the Turkish government started opening and investing in more state universities in the Anatolian provinces. So about 80 new universities have been established, which is clearly a very positive indicator for increased educational opportunities for young people living outside of the mega urban centers, Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, and Bursa. These are also young people who are usually the first graduates in their families. So on an economic perspective, you can see this is also part of creating a stronger middle class, a more resilient middle class. It's all part and parcel in Turkey's economic, social, and political development. However, it's not enough just to have a university. You need to also have the mechanisms that help young people transition, be prepared for and transition from education to employment. And a lot of these universities are still in their beginning years of giving graduates, getting to know employers, employers getting to know them. So unfortunately, young people who graduate from these mostly second-tier universities are having a really hard time penetrating the job market, even though they have some incredible, unique qualities and are certainly very capable. Usually just the name of the school is enough for an employer to disregard. So we're dealing with an increase in opportunity of education, but a decrease in opportunity for employment. The second development, which I think is positive, is the ESG and DEI frameworks, the diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is kind of, I want to say in some cases forcing, and maybe in other cases encouraging companies, investment houses, and so asset managers to be much more careful about where investments are going and what kind of responsibilities those institutions are having. And as part of that, of course, equal opportunity is a critical piece. And so this helps us in terms of our connections and communications with the industry. And instead of saying, by giving a young person an equal opportunity, you're not just doing, a good thing, but you're doing the right thing. And then this kind of connects into other narratives, which I think are very important and still some more to do. And of course, finally, the pandemic. A lot of young people have stopped going to university physically. And even though the pandemic is over, the social fabric of those universities are a lot weaker. And in fact, what made these young people, especially the ones that we select in this program, what made them really strong candidates is that they were volunteers, active in clubs, getting experience and actually doing something and not just going to school. Turkey is not a country in which a lot of young people have part-time jobs and opportunities to really learn how to work necessarily. So these kinds of other experiences are very important. So the weakening of that fabric has made it quite challenging in the sense of we're looking at a new generation of young people graduating from university, which need almost extra support in that transition to work. So how we're adapting, first of all, we've invested incredibly in research. We've done control group trials. We're just about to finish a SROI assessment. We've done public opinion surveys, focus groups, all kinds of data. And so the adaptation comes with keeping a very strong finger on the pulse of what's happening with young people and what's happening in Turkey. And economic indicators don't point to anything getting better in the short term. Unfortunately, the cost of living, partially as a result of the pandemic, a global issue, but also because of Turkey's particular economic situation, that cost of living is a great challenge because a lot of the jobs are in Istanbul, and even some programs that young people benefit from are based in Istanbul, and that's going to mean that they have to stay more local. And we've adapted to that by actually starting to support young people in their third and fourth year in these second-tier schools, giving them English language training, which Berlitz offers. We actually fund Berlitz to do this. And it's incredible the kind of results we're getting just from that support from us. And the brand name, the Sabancı family, is akin to the Rockefeller family, at least in terms of name and status in its own community and its own country. And so that signaling effect has been really powerful. And we're adapting in the sense of also going further into the pipeline. And we're now looking at different ways of engaging with NGOs, which we fund to employ first-year graduates to get that experience. We're looking at different ways to expand beyond just supporting NGOs in that, but how do we engage the private sector in changing their hiring practices, which is, maybe many of you know, is a very challenging thing, especially if you're focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Felice. Investing in research, following the data and understanding and keeping a hand on the pulse of what is really happening with young people, and thinking about, great ways to engage with proximal partners such as your NGOs that you're working with. And those are ways in which you're adapting to the change that you're seeing. Thank you. I'll go on to you, Christine. Lever for Change has created an open call challenge model that is successful and is currently being piloted by McKinsey Scott's Yield Giving. First, can you explain what that open challenge model is, why being an open call is important for many people who may not know, and tell us a bit about how it builds on past insights to become the program it is today. Christine.
Sure, and I just want to echo everyone's thoughts and really excited to be here today. And good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to those of you who are joining from around the world. So Lever for Change was founded in 2019 to really help donors find and fund solutions to some of the world's biggest problems. The goal was to really fund organizations at scale and provide them grants over a period of time that would allow them to make significant progress towards critical impact. So when we founded Lever for Change, we were really focused on very large grants to provide projects that were focused on solving a critical problem. And what we heard over time was that a lot of donors, we ran 11 of those challenges. We've had a lot of success in the past. Since 2019, we've unlocked over $1 billion in capital with that process. But we also were hearing was that some donors would like to really provide general operating support to a cohort of organizations and to embrace that trust-based philanthropy that has really started to become more centered in the philanthropic space. And so we decided to develop this new philanthropic model that holds true to our values of openness and transparency, which is a big part of how we run all of our challenges at Lever for Change, but to really move from a challenge model to a larger open call that's focused on general operating support to a larger cohort of grantees. So we launched this new service and this new philanthropic model with Mackenzie Scott's team earlier this year. The idea was to really provide an opportunity for the organizations who receive grants to grow and for her to strengthen a field of organizations through that open call process. So this new field building open call model, as we're currently calling it, we know that may not be the exact right name for it yet, but we're struggling to find a better name. But essentially how we're defining field can be very broad, right? So in this particular challenge, the field is a specific geography, it's the United States, and it's a specific kind of organization. It's an organization with a budget between $1 to $5 million, right? So there was some parameters, but otherwise it was a pretty large field of organizations. But really this model can be tailored to donors who want to focus on a particular topic or other geographies, et cetera, right? So there's a lot of flexibility for us to work with donors to really create something that fits their needs and what they're looking for in terms of building up a field from their perspective of donor and their strategy and where they really want to double down on their funding over the next period of time. The commitment is a minimum of $20 million that is granted out to awardees at least $1 million a piece. And again, this is really because we want to try and push donors to provide these catalytic grants that will allow organizations to grow, to have the flexibility that they need to really be able to harness critical moments in time for their organization in order to have impact. How we've developed this model is really based on a lot of the learnings that we have had over running all of these other 11 challenges. So we've been running challenges at the $10 million level or more. That goes all the way up to, we recently ran a challenge for the Lego Foundation that was approximately $143 million when we launched, a little bit less than that when we finished because of changes in currency. We've also run Kellogg Foundation's $90 million challenge focused on racial equity. And right now we're also running a $10 million challenge focused on maternal and infant health. So we really have a range of those challenges. As I said, we have built all of this with openness and transparency in mind. One of the critiques we often get is whether or not challenges are equitable, right? Because you're asking organizations to put in work and not every organization is getting funded. The flip side of that is many organizations can't get funding because they don't know a program officer, or they don't know how to get an introduction, or they can't get access to a donor, right? And philanthropy tends to kind of keep funding within their networks of known entities and known organizations. And by providing a platform to really have an open call and a transparent process where we list all the criteria that is critical for the donor in making their decision. We provide clarity around what that process is. We provide a timeline. We provide feedback to all of the organizations and everybody we provide very clear parameters on who is eligible and who is not eligible so that organizations aren't wasting their time if they don't fall in that particular bucket. And we really try to do a lot to ensure that organizations know exactly what to anticipate in the process, and that many more organizations are getting access to that process than maybe a typical sourcing process that donors might have to go through because of limited staff capacity. So we've continued to build on that model. We have continued to augment it. We now make sure that we have an evaluation panel that is incredibly diverse. So I can talk a little bit more about that later. But we, again, we continue to clarify all of our processes, our eligibility criteria. and do as much as we can to really continue to learn what's been frustrating for organizations, adapt those things, tweak our process to continue to make it as easy as possible for organizations to participate. We also try and keep some questions, as many questions as possible, consistent through every one of our open calls and challenges. So that helps organizations move more quickly, apply more quickly, and not having to reinvent the wheel every single time they apply to the process. And then the last thing I'll comment on is that for organizations who don't make it all the way through, and for organizations who become finalists but maybe not awardees in our process, we also continue to do a lot of marketing and try and get those organizations in front of a variety of donors. So even at the end of the day, if an organization doesn't receive an award, but they really made it to, they were a top performing organization in one of our open calls, we do a lot to elevate the profile of the organizations and continue to amplify that work in the hopes of unlocking capital for many of those organizations, not just the one single awardee or the 10 single awardees, or in this case, the 250 awardees that will receive a $1 million grant in the Yield Giving Open Call. So I'll pause there.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. And I really like that, amplifying, helping to amplify the voices of the organizations that are not your finalist or not your, they're not the awardee, but also helping to amplify. So everyone is a winner, openness, transparency, and to all intents and purposes, everyone is a winner in the process. I'd just like to follow on, and I know you touched on it, talking about, the diverse voices and the panels. Can you tell us how this challenge model incorporates diverse voices from different sectors on your evaluation panels and beyond?
Sure. So we work really hard to create a diverse panel of evaluators for every one of our challenges. We have a growing pool of global evaluators that we pull from for every single one of our challenges. For the current challenge, we have 56% of the evaluators identifying as non-white. And so they're from Latin American ethnicities, Indigenous persons, African, Afro-Caribbean, and Black persons, as well as Asian persons. So we're really trying to create a really diverse panel. Additionally, 6% of the evaluators have identified as having a disability, and 68% of our evaluators are female. We're always looking for more men, so we somehow have a challenge of recruiting men. So only 29% of our evaluators in this last challenge are men. So any men out there that are interested in participating as evaluators, definitely let us know. And then we have subject area expertise that ranges for this particular challenge, ranges from education to philanthropy to community and economic development. So we're very intentional about how we recruit evaluators for every single one of our challenges and trying to ensure that we have a very diverse set of perspectives. Additionally, as organizations go through our process and become finalists, we work with an array of different types of technical support providers, including diversity, equity, and inclusion advisors, where we have them review the proposals and give feedback to the organizations. And then organizations can actually get one-on-one support from those diversity, equity, and inclusion advisors, as well as we have a separate disability inclusion advisor that we provide technical support to organizations, in that process. And then in the follow-on, after they are in our network, we provide 2 years of ongoing support through a diversity of different providers. So we really try and bring diversity as much as possible into our process and ensure that there is a variety of people who are looking at these proposals and bringing those different kinds of perspectives to bear as organizations are going through the process.
Great, thank you. I really like that, how diverse indeed the panels are, looking at, of course, the different elements from your DEI, as well as whether it's ethnic, whether it's technical, whether it's demographic. I really like that. And I'd like to lend my voice to the men, We're looking for men to join the panel. I'd just like to go back to you, Phyllis, for a moment. And you did start to talk about the work that you do that has a strong focus on youth employment. Can you tell us about how you leverage partnership to do your work and the importance of partnership in you being able to achieve your objectives at SS Social?
Yeah, sure. So we also fund nonprofit organizations working in arts and culture, migration, education, environment, all sorts of fields. And so because we're lacking a very strong organization in Turkey that focuses on youth unemployment, we decided we would fund those organizations to hire and employ new university graduates from these second-tier universities for 1 year. And we pay their salaries in the form of a grant to the NGO. And for that 1 year, they're part of this cohort and they become part of a family, actually. So those NGOs are actually our core partners. It's the managers. We make sure that those positions are vetted, the managers are vetted. We make sure that that 1 year is going to be something that's going to be experientially rewarding for that young person. And we also give them mentorship, English training, other forms of training, networking opportunities. And of course, they end the program with a reference letter with Emine Sabancı Kamışlı, who is the head of Esas Sosyal on behalf of her family. And this just opens all kinds of doors for these young people and really just gives them opportunities to make choices that they maybe couldn't make in their careers otherwise. So our main partners are NGOs. Our other partners are corporates. They help fund some of these programs. Some of them directly make the grants to the NGOs themselves. They would like to be part of that funding circle. Obviously, we work with companies who act as mock interviewers. They act as trainers, mentors, and supporters. We have thousands and thousands of people, almost over 4,500 in this ecosystem now, that are all in one way connected to one another. And one other really important factor here is that we have a tradition in philanthropy in Turkey that is very focused on education. People love giving scholarships. They really believe that education is actually an opportunity for a better future. Yet without that employment aspect, we're really starting to see that that educational support is not enough. So what we do is we try to build on people's investments in education through scholarships, through other programs, and make sure that we don't let that person get left behind. So whoever's been invested in already, we try to continue that investment. That doesn't restrict the type of young person that can benefit from the program, but we try to maximize and leverage other social investments when we're selecting and supporting these young people. So in that sense, the partnership is leveraged and we're able to not only support young people, but I think here the idea is how do we convey the importance of making more equitable hiring practices possible. And so each of the 200 young people who have finished the program so far are now working in 140 different companies, NGOs, a small percentage in the public sector, and they're starting to hire young people like themselves. So that is really opening doors. So even our young people are actually our partners. Thank you for the question.
Fantastic. So paying it forward or paying it back, if you will, because they're now recruiting people who are like them, who ordinarily would not have that opportunity. But I also like the fact that you talk about ecosystem partnerships and how you've built an ecosystem that will not only grow, but continue to reinforce itself as it continues to expand and build the network as you work through your proximal partners who are the NGOs in the communities where you need them to be, hiring this otherwise disadvantaged graduates as well. Thank you. Thank you, Feliz. I'll come to you now more. The Loudest Foundation has a strong focus on equitable engagement and working with communities. You spoke about that so eloquently earlier. How do these values show up in your work, on a day-to-day basis, on the types of funding or projects that you work on at Loudest Foundation?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we really do believe that equity is the core of solving the climate crisis. And so what we do in Loudest as we approached our systems thinking, as we built our systems thinking approach, is we focused on the interplay between four actors that are critical in setting the agenda of the global economy. The first is policymakers. The second is finance and investment, et cetera, that system. The third is business. And the fourth are group that we kind of term workers, communities, producers, and the movements that link to them. So for us, these actors exist in a constant dance when we're thinking about how they interplay in shaping the rules and the application of those rules in a global economy. So at that core, our whole frame views the criticality of workers, producers, communities, and movements as core agents of change, as core impacted by change. So really what we've done is by embedding that kind of set of actors across our work, it means that our grant making also then looks at the dynamics between those actors. So all of our grants have real core equity-based considerations that we build into them. We also support our grantee partners with a lot of non-grant support. We have a team that focuses on what we call organizational strengthening and learning. And so essentially we're trying to support the creation of learning cultures within each of our partners. And so we provide resources to support their learning questions, learning strategies, et cetera, so that they can then build sort of inquisitive and learning cultures. We also have a team focused on gender equity and social inclusion. Those are providing resources directly to our partners on building their capacity on being more intersectional, thinking about intersectional approaches, et cetera. So outside of just the pure grant making, we deliver a whole package of support to partners that seeks to deepen their equity work, as well as creating a learning sort of dynamic within their organizations. And for us, that's really kind of critical to our theory of change. Partners need to be strong and resilient. And oftentimes donors kind of, because of competing priorities, yank them around. I come from the nonprofit side. I was the CEO of a nonprofit, and I still believe that the best grant makers happen to be those people that understand what the pull is like to be a small startup NGO. And so I think really for us as trying to challenge the philanthropic space, we really are sort of looking at the total 360 of an organization and how we can support it. And I think that's really core to our commitment on equity.
Great, thank you. Something that resonates is really, what you said about partners needing to be strong and to be resilient, because beyond the one grant or two grants, they need to have, sustainability of meaningful projects that are impactful to the people and the communities that need them the most, and they need all of the support. So beyond the whether it's the grant support, you also have non-grant support. And I think that's very useful in shifting how we think about grants and grantees, and even how to have systemic change or transformative change, if you will. Thanks.
And Henrietta,
Christy,
can I just add one, sorry to interrupt.
Please, go ahead.
Just one other thing that I failed to mention, which I think is really critical for us in philanthropy, is to consider the well-being of our partners. So we often think about our partners as delivering against a specific KPI, a rubric, or an outcome. We dehumanize the fact that these are people that have challenging costs, that are working on challenging issues. So this year we are rolling out well-being support to our partners, and we're trialing mechanisms to do that, where partners can, as part of their general grant application, add a line item that allows them to benefit from well-being support. And to me, this is really critical. We heard this need from our partners, particularly with the global sort of the crises that we're facing, the war, inflation, et cetera. So I think it would be really interesting if RPA is also looking at kind of how donors are aggregating on well-being. We'd be really keen to share some of our learnings from our efforts here.
Absolutely. And I'm sure we will be getting in touch to understand better how the well-being support is being implemented. And indeed, you're right. The pandemic had a real effect on not only NGOs, not only people, but on our grantees and partners. And so the remnants of that effect, we need to be addressing and thinking about when we think about the long-term sustainability of our proximal partners, most importantly. Thanks for that, Amol. Very useful indeed. I'll come to you now, Christine. The three organizations that are represented on this panel today are really different from one another, whether we're talking about focus, we're talking about approaches or geographic locations. But one common thing that we see is that each one of these organizations go beyond purely financial support, as in the example that Amol just gave, talking about well-being support as an example, as well as capacity building. So I'd like to ask, can you talk a little bit about the reputational and communication support Lever for Change also offers to grantees in a bit more detail?
Sure. And I love, Amal, that you're doing well-being support, and I'd love to talk to you offline about that and learn more, because I think that's a phenomenal idea. So at Lever for Change, what we have done is we have partnered with and we have a dynamic set of vendors that we partner with that provide different types of technical and capacity support. And it's really demand driven, because I think, as Amal pointed out, a lot of organizations are in this constant push-pull with donors. You know, we've heard from some leaders. I've had to take 3 leadership courses this year because every donor requires us to take a leadership course, you know, and so that just kind of gets to be repetitive and is not useful, and it's just a time suck for organizations. So what we've tried to do is create more of an a la carte offering of different types of capacity support from different types of providers, global providers, domestic US domestic providers, et cetera, to provide a range of different types of support, recognizing that organizations at different points in time are going to have the time and the ability to opt in versus the time, not the time or ability, or maybe they want to do strategic planning, but they can't do it this year. It's got to be next year. You know, so really trying to provide a dynamic set of supports, and they range from everything from fundraising. Of course, that's one of the number one things that we hear from organizations that they want is additional fundraising support. But, you know, so we do fundraising, the typical ones, fundraising, leadership, et cetera. But we also do other ones that are a little bit more outside of the box, which is why I'm curious about this well-being one. We've done things like support organizations to think about how they can be a better trauma-informed organization. So if you're working with people in poverty, if you're working with people, with refugees who have been through crisis, you know, how do you as an organization approach that in a trauma-informed way? And many organizations are working with those kinds of populations. It might look different in every situation and with a lot of different organizations, but that's an important thing for them to take into consideration. So we try and offer that range of support services. We try and find interesting providers that are doing things that are a little outside the box to provide opportunities to organizations to opt in to participate. And we also try and make it available to any person in the organization. So one of the partnerships that we have is with an organization called Catch a Fire that provides pro bono professional services. They do everything from like, they have pro bono executive coaches all the way down to like, we need to rebuild our contact management system, right? So that very technical to very kind of high level support, and make that available to everybody in the organization, not just the leader of the organization who's often being pulled in a lot of different directions. So it's a way for smaller organizations to provide the kind of professional development support or mentoring that they might need for more junior staff or for mid-level staff in a way that's cost effective for them. So that's our approach. We really try and want to make it things that are value added to the organization at times when it can be supportive for them and useful for them, and not something that they're required to do or take advantage of.
Great, thanks, Christine. I like the fact that it's demand driven, you know, what they need. And it's really, you know, while it's not cookie cutter, but it's really responsive to the need of the organizations. I'd just like to take a moment to, you know, reiterate one more time for our audience. Please feel free. I see a lot of comments in the chat and responses from our panelists, which is great. So the conversation is both live and on the chat box as well. But I'd like to ask that you also, you know, if you have questions, feel free to put it in the chat box or in the Q&A on the call, so we can also tee that up when we get into the Q&A section. And so I go to you now, Felice. At ESA Social, you have a unique structure as a social investment arm within a financial or asset management group, ESA's group. How have you navigated through this decision of not becoming a traditional foundation with your approach and structure, given the work that you do and the impact you're hoping to have?
Well, I can start by saying this, and it's not because I love RPA, everything it does and everyone it employs, but if there were an RPA, we would have all of our problems solved, because then we can just have a fiscal sponsorship agreement and be on our way. And to be honest, for the past few years, that's what I've been trying to construct. There's not necessarily a need for another foundation, for another profit. We are sort of underwriters. We are trying to integrate the issue of diversity, equity, inclusion when it comes to youth unemployment, when it comes to hiring young people and offering them, especially their first jobs and their first opportunities. So we're an ecosystem actor. And in that sense, the necessity to create a kind of stagnant, in a way, institution, not stagnant in the sense that it cannot renew itself, but one that is placed in time and in structure with a certain legal and fiscal mechanism as we're learning, adapting. What is the sector going to need? Is it going to need a social intervention that's more like creating a youth unemployment agency at some point? Is it going to need a more network structure? Is it going to be spinned off and incubated in a different way? There's so many different directions that this could go, and it's still also new. So one of the main pieces to navigate that is not necessarily what structure, legal structure, because as an operation in terms of governance, we run very much like a foundation, a family foundation, in fact. Yet, if you look at it, on one hand, we also work like a nonprofit. We also work like social entrepreneurs. We also work like social investors. So it's a very kind of hybrid organization. And in that sense, you know, choosing one structure, it could be very limiting on many levels. But really, first and foremost, we desperately need solutions like fiscal sponsorship in Turkey, so that I think more people would do more if they didn't feel so bound by the legal and fiscal necessity to give this kind of separate corporate identity. But I'd also like to loop back on something else, which is the idea that this backbone support organization, you know, that Mark Kramer and his team has written about so much in terms of collective impact, we're really in the background. We're not in the foreground. In the foreground are the NGOs we fund so that those young people have job opportunities, and also we're contributing to the NGOs' human capacity. You know, we're in the background trying to advocate for companies and employers to have more equal hiring practices and to give more young people opportunities. And so, you know, backbone support organizations also need to be quite nimble, very open, and very flexible ecosystem actors. And I think that in terms of working with philanthropic organizations, we have a lot to learn from this kind of hybrid nature. For example, 75% of the participants in our program are young women, and they're most likely to be unemployed after school. And what we're doing now is using this opportunity we did a gender audit of all of our programs to look to see what else we can do to promote gender equity. So we're doing what we can to promote equity in employment, but what about gender? What about the other intersections there that we need to look for? And so now we're able to encourage all the NGOs that we fund in the protocol that we sign to adhere to some common equality principles and practices. And we look to try to do that with some of our corporate partners as well. So we're moving in a place where we want to be able to act as a larger equitable system, as opposed to one organization trying to promote or push a certain agenda. And I think in that sense, being the social investment arm of the company has given that a little bit more flexibility. But I'll be honest, 90% of the people we interact with, especially in Turkey, think we're a foundation. They don't really question. And so I guess that's a good thing. They see that this is being done for a social purpose and a social return. And they believe in that philanthropy, and they believe in that more strategic approach.
Indeed. So this is one great example where a lack of structure or a hybrid structure actually confers an advantage and not a disadvantage, and gives you the flexibility and nimbleness to be what you need to be to different ecosystem partners, basically across board. Great. I'll come to you, Chris, Amor. You touched on it earlier when you spoke about the Loudest Foundation being a learning organization. I just want you to expatiate for us, if you will, how you build systems change into your organization in a holistic way, and how you encourage the utilization of this real-time learning to drive impact in the work that you do.
Yeah, I love this question because I think it is really critical because we don't have time to repeat mistakes of the past, and we need to fail forward and be comfortable with failure, because philanthropy is, as we all say, society's risk capital. I feel this every day, the absolute privilege of being able to support frontline and the most innovative people on the front lines of these issues. And so I think with that, we have a commitment to make sure that we're doing that the best possible way. So we deployed some innovations at Loudest when we got off the ground, which was that we moved from a KPI system of measurement to what we call rubrics. We also de-centered ourselves from that process. So we don't seek to assess what we contributed or attribute, essentially we're moving to a system away from attribution and towards contribution, rather, where essentially we're asking our partners to help us figure out how they're making a dent in the system. And so really, it's been kind of game changing in how we also look at ourselves. We have also adopted really strong language about how we work with and through our partners. Again, decentering ourselves and recognizing that they're the real leaders of this. The other thing is that we created a learning culture by hiring and leading, placing in a very senior role a head of learning. And so what she did was bring in a total learning model. So we have learning champions that are dispersed across each team. Each team has one learning champion. Those learning champions engage in learning activities with their teams. And then that all gobbles up to our strategy adaptation process each year. So those learning questions and those learning processes help build a learning culture within the organization. We have a fail fest where every year all staff join and we tell stories of failure, and we dress up in tuxedos and dresses, and we have the background being like the Oscars, where we celebrate the biggest failures that we've made. So we destigmatize failure. So I think all of these aspects are cultural shifts within our foundation and our partner ecosystem that makes it okay for people to feel like this is a place that's based on trust, and that we celebrate risk and taking risk, and we're going to be there to catch our partners if they fail, because that's part of it. And we're challenging these systems that are intractable and huge. And so we need to take risks and we need to be bold. So anyway, all of that to say, it's really a cultural transformation we've sought to do. And we measure that cultural we sort of base that cultural transformation in our systems and processes by moving to things like rubrics. And we're not perfect, we're still learning. And I think that's also really critical, being able to step back and say what's not working and what can we change to make our partners and our impact more significant.
I mean, the chat is blowing up right now, everyone loving the fail fest. I can just imagine how much fun dressing up in tuxedos and ball gowns to celebrate the failures. But that's fantastic, because it gives people the freedom to fail and to learn from that failure and take the risks, like you say, that will help us solve the really big problems and challenges that we have in the world. We need people to still continue to be big, bold, and think about those problems outside of the box, irrespective of failure. So I really, really appreciate that. I would like to turn over now to Q&A. I'll just ask, specifically, I think there are questions. There's a question for Felice. I'll start with that one in the chat, in the Q&A box. Are young people you support involved in the planning process or the grant decision making? How participatory is your approach? I can't pronounce that word, but I know you're good for it, Felice.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks in Turkish. Thank you, Helena. I think that's how I say your name. So Emine Sabancı Kamışlı, the family member and the lead of Esas Sosyal, she has it's more beautiful in Turkish, but I'll translate it, and it goes something like, "You are here and I see you." And that is the essence of the program, which is about young people being seen. They often feel like their families are working 4, 5, 6 jobs just to put them through school. They're doing what they can to finish school, and then they're left feeling very unnoticed and very rejected, actually. And this is not very encouraging especially for a population, a youth population the size that we have. So yes, they're very involved. First of all, after they finish the program, they're part of an alumni group, and they're now helping the new ones on board find new jobs. Even during the earthquake, they supported each other. They drove to different locations to bring their families tents and medicines and so forth. I mean, it's really a very strongly knit cohort. So it's quite powerful, the kind of identity and identification you're able to offer people who don't really get that from other places, especially their schools or other places in the community. So yes, very involved. And we especially ask about managers, should we fund this position again? Should that, position be supported? Does that person have opportunities to learn, or is it more clerical and so forth? So yeah, they're involved in all aspects of the work. And I have to say, since I transitioned out of the active director role a few years ago. I continue as an advisor. Özlem Akgün Eşmeler is the new director, operational and executive director of the institution, and she's built an incredible team and a whole bunch of other new programs that promote more meaningful youth engagement as our community grows.
Great. Thanks, Phyllis. I'll ask, I don't see any other questions, although there was quite a lot of conversation around the well-being support. So Amol, I don't know if you wanted to, touch on that a bit more in a bit more detail, just to give everyone a sense of how it's done, and what's it about.
Yeah, sure. And I also emphasize that we're very much on the beginning end of this journey, the start of this journey, rather. It was something that really became very clear to us when we were experiencing the sort of the after effects of COVID, and also in some of the markets where we work, the increased political scrutiny that nonprofits are under revealed to us that there is a critical and I would say even a kind of a huge strategic risk for all of us, which is that those that are on these front lines are not supported in ways that enhance their well-being. And so I'm not just talking about the leadership level of organizations, I mean staff across the board. And so we heard this from our partners in our annual retreat where we surveyed what they would really need from us. And it was revealing, because instead of asking for more grants, a lot of them said we need time, we need support, we need leadership capacity, we need a step back, we need time to sit and strategize, and our teams need to be supported too. So I think, like, in a way, the philanthropic world has sort of replicated the world of the market, and this race to the impact we've substituted for their race to the dollar. And I think we just all need to recognize that, like, no one's going to win if we're just playing the same game with a different word for it. And so I think for us, the well-being support has been, we're trialing it this year. We're going to be rolling it out. So essentially, as I mentioned, partners can allocate a portion of their grant budget on top of their grant budget, let me say, based on engagement with their program manager. And we're going to do it very trust-based. There's been a lot of literature that says, it should be this and not that. We just want to let the partners guide where they need the support. So if they want to buy sneakers for their staff to encourage them to go out and walk during breaks, great. If they want to do yoga every Wednesday, great. If they want to take their staff for a retreat, great. We're capping it at an amount just so we can disperse it as broadly as we can. So it's not like a blank check. But after this, we'll learn what worked and what didn't, and then we'll edit and we'll modify from there. But I think our commitment to partner well-being will continue in some form or the other. And I think this idea of applying it to on top of their grants is a really clean and easy way to execute it.
Great. Fantastic. I like the fact that it's trust-based. So, they can do whatever they want. They have the real agency to determine what they absolutely need for themselves and for their people. Thank you. I see another question, and it's for you, Kristen. It says, as Lever for Change moves deeper into the space of advising donors and managing challenges for external partners, will there be more informal ways to connect prospective grantees with donors outside of the Bold Solutions Network and intensive challenge grant process? Would appreciate any insights into how this activity will roll out in the future.
Sure.
Kristen.
Right now, I have to say we are very much so focused on the Bold Solution Network and organizations who have come through our process, not because we don't want to be connecting other organizations, but we have currently, I think, 94 organizations in the network, and we are really focused on trying to raise money for those organizations. We know their work. We've gone through a process with them. We've gotten to know them, right? So there's a certain level of understanding about their work and how they operate as a team. And so for us, that's really our main priority. That doesn't mean that we won't be having other opportunities in the future for connecting organizations that don't come through our process. But for right now, our goal is to really say, these organizations went through a process. We recognize that there's a certain amount of labor intensity that is involved. And so in order to bring as much value add as possible to those organizations, that's where we have tended to focus our energy and likely will in the future. We're also a small team dealing with all of the other things that we've been talking about today in terms of capacity and bandwidth and trying to ensure that we're being as intentional as possible about how we're raising organizations up and elevating and who, and making that equitable across the organizations that are in our pipeline. And so all of that takes it takes a certain amount of thinking and learning and doing to manage all those processes as well.
Great, thank you. And I see Amor
Yeah.
confirming that you should get well-being support too. I agree completely. If there are no more questions, I'd just like to say, today we have discussed a lot around innovative and flexible approaches to accelerating or deepening philanthropy that is clearly centered on people, clearly centered on learning from failures. We heard about the fail fest, and that's going to be one of my favorites for a long time to come. And I'm going to be looking out to see, how we can encourage projects to do that, or encourage funders and grantees to do that as well, because learning is important. But really, these innovative and flexible approaches, whether they're in different focus areas or across different geographies, they're all at the intersectionality of issues, that some that are cross-cutting, some that are much more broader, so some of the issues that we see in our world today. And we have heard about some of the leading practices and tools from real life, based on the current realities today, and some of the examples that we've seen that are clearly impactful as they center on pursuing equity, as well as centering on our people. I think that some of these approaches that we have discussed today, whether it's from the open call challenge model to centering intersectionality to create transformative change and navigating challenging environments, actually also have to do with ceding control. I think it was Amor that spoke about trust-based philanthropy, just talking about the well-being grant. But really, if you think through the thread of what we've heard here today, is really there's some aspect of it that cedes control, whether it's the way we measure ourselves, the way we measure success, capital and decision making being put in the hands of the people that need to make the decisions, because they're more proximate to the issues for greater and more sustainable impact today. So while there's really no one right approach, as we can see from all of what we've discussed today, because the problems and the communities are as diverse as they come, and so will be the required responses. But we can all agree that philanthropy needs to respond to the challenge to become much more equitable, much more inclusive and diverse, and responsive to the needs. And it is this commitment that must guide our sector's work going into the future. But the conversation does not end here today. For more about this topic and RPA's work, please visit our website at rockpa.org and follow us on Twitter and on LinkedIn as well. And also just to remind everyone that we will send the link to this recording via email to everyone who's registered. And the link will also be available on our website, rockpa.org. And also please stay tuned for future seminars in this series and for the upcoming book launch as well. Finally, on behalf of RPA and all of my colleagues, I would like to thank and appreciate each one of you. Amor, Felice, Kristen, thank you for your contributions here today. You have done an outstanding job of sharing your experience and insights so generously with us today. So thank you. I'd like to thank all of our participants who have dialed in from all over the world today as well. Thank you for your excellent engagement and interaction, and for staying through with us to the end. We trust that this has been an excellent use of your time. Thank you, and we look forward to hosting you again at future RPA events. Thank you and goodbye from RPA and from Lagos, Nigeria. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Henrietta. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.